So we understand from an economic perspective why regional integration is so important for Africa. In principle, the commitment is there from the countries. But when it comes to implementation, we're not seeing tangible results. That is, the numbers are not speaking about growth in Africa when it comes to inter-regional trade. Why is that?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important for us to understand the scale of the challenge. As you rightly said, trade integration in Africa is lagging behind by a lot. If we look at intra-African trade numbers, for example, only 10% of trade from African countries happens within the continent. So 90% happens outside of the continent. This compares with a number of 50% for Asia, of intra-Asian African trade, and about 70% for Europe. So there's a huge, huge challenge. The objective of this conference is exactly to try to address the question you're posing, to try to understand why are we lagging so much, why are we falling so much behind when it comes to integration. And there are a number of aspects that we're going to explore during the conference.
One of which is leadership. Do you think it's also due to a lack of political will from Africa's leaders when it comes to implementing these strategies?
I think first, it might be because there is not a full recognition of the benefits from regional integration. So hopefully what this conference will provide is a better sense of the benefits, the long-term benefits from regional integration. On the question of leadership, there are good news and bad news. The good news is that regional integration is progressing at different rates in different sub-regions in Africa. So at least in some parts of the continent there is indeed leadership, which shows that it is possible. Now, leadership is one of the drivers, but leaders respond to a large extent to incentives also. So it's important for us, and we have a session actually in the conference that is trying to understand better the political economy of regional integration, to try to understand what are the drivers of political leaders in making them move forward on the regional integration front.
And we know one region within Africa that's doing particularly well when it comes to integration is the SADC region. That's also because of the transport corridors that exist.
Exactly. So one of the elements that's important for us to have better integration is the abolition of tariffs, for example, trade tariffs, trade restrictions, movements, barriers to the movement of goods, to the movement of service, to the movement of people. So SADC has made a lot of progress on that front. The East Africa community has also made some progress on this front. But I should say that even in these regions where there's been a lot of progress, the potential has not been fully fulfilled yet. So one of the reasons, as you mentioned, is infrastructure. If we have good infrastructure, good cross-country infrastructure, that makes the movement easier. But sometimes infrastructure is there, and there are other kinds of barriers. For example, lengthy procedures at borders that make trade and the movement of people difficult.
Is it also because there are more favorable trade policies with international countries, historically by nature, that exist, that forces some of these African countries to continue with those trade policies? But certainly, if anything, the financial crisis, the global economic crisis, is a token that Africa should wake up to the reality that it needs to trade more with itself and depend on each other.
Well, I think you're right. In the historical weight of how historically African traded with the rest of the world still has a bearing on where we are in terms of trade relations. So most historically in the colonial era, most of the trade relations were between African countries and European countries. So the infrastructure, soft infrastructure as well as the hard infrastructure is set up to facilitate that kind of trade. And so that legacy is still there to a large extent. You're right also in that with the crisis, it became clear that African countries need to look more within their own continent to become more resilient to this kind of external shocks. If they are dependent only on demand from outside the continent, if there is a crisis similar to the one we had, then they become very vulnerable to economic shocks.
You mentioned earlier that part of the objective of this conference is to highlight the economic benefits of regional integration, but we should have moved beyond that. Now, we should be talking about implementation.
Yes.
But just if you could re-highlight the economic benefits for Africa to get regional integration going at a more rapid pace.
Well, see, I think one of the challenges we face is that even though the benefits are recognized, some of these benefits will unfold over many years, and many of them over the long term. And regional integration also brings costs, sometimes short-term costs. So countries, for example, that rely a lot on trade taxes for their fiscal revenue are reluctant to abolish trade barriers because they are afraid that they will suffer on the fiscal front, which is a legitimate concern actually. So we have to look into the motivations of different countries, the challenges they face, and to see if there are mechanisms that would help mitigate these concerns. For example, one possible idea is to have mechanisms of solidarity so that countries can be compensated as they transition towards more integration by other countries that are already more integrated with the rest of the continent.
So smaller countries are still sticking to their arguments to hold on to non-tariff barriers as an important source of revenue.
Well, exactly. They are concerned that if they lose their trade taxes, that they will have a huge impact on their fiscal revenues, which is a legitimate concern. Now, we know that over the long term, as integration moves forward, the economy diversifies, the tax base increases, growth will pick up, and in the end this will generate revenues. But again, this process unfolds over time, and the benefits sometimes take time to accrue to countries, while the costs happen in the short term. So we have to, in economics we call this kind of problems time consistency problems. We have to address these issues of time consistency. Another related issue is that the costs and benefits do not accrue to the same groups within a country and across countries. So there are groups that benefit from the current situation. Business groups, some parts of society that benefit, that gain from the fact that we have less regional integration. So there have to be mechanisms, again, to compensate and provide incentives for regional integration to move forward by sort of compensating these people that tend to lose as the process moves forward.
What kind of external leadership does Africa need when it comes to implementation? Because if we have to look at the global trend, we see the EU doing particularly well when it comes to integration as an example.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but you see, the European Union integration also took a long time to unfold. It was not easy. So Africa can look at the EU, but it shouldn't look only at where it is now. It has to look at the time it took for the European Union to build its European economic community. It took 50, 60 years or more to get to the stage where it is now. So I think the European Union is a good example. There are also good examples in Asia, good examples in Latin America, all at different stages of development. And Africa itself, as we discussed earlier, within at the sub-regional level also starts to have good examples of integration. For example, in West Africa there's already a common currency shared by many countries that came about even before there was a common currency for some countries in Europe. So in some aspects Africa was actually ahead in terms of regional integration than the rest of the world. So we have to look at lessons from outside, but also look at the good lessons that exist within Africa.
But also when you look at Africa, there are political policies that do not support one country to trade with another. For example, the political issue in Zimbabwe is not favorable for this region to have Zimbabwe, and it has contributed some controversy to US policies.
Right, so these political issues exist across the continent, not only here,
Africa
but in other regions.
Africa is a lot more diverse than other continents.
Yes, there's a lot of diversity in Africa, but there's equally lots of diversity in Asia, for example, and even within Europe, I would think. But it's true that this, unless we get more progress on political issues, on concerns about security, and unless these problems are settled, it's difficult to move on the economic front. So again, in Europe and Latin America and even in Asia, we saw the similar dynamics. While until the problem of security is not fully settled, it's difficult to move on the economic integration front.
How do you move integration and take it a step forward from where it is at the moment?
I think,
what is the most pressing challenge that Africa faces to move implementation forward? We know, like I said earlier, the commitment is there.
I think there are two aspects to it. I think there are short-term actions that could be taken. There are low-hanging fruits where Africa could quickly move forward and show the benefits of better integration. For example, on air travel, it's more expensive now to travel between some African countries, especially in Central Africa, than to travel from one of the Central African countries to Europe. I mean, it doesn't make sense. It's clear that there are inefficiency aspects, and by clearly moving to show that by better integrating, for example, on the air travel front, there are huge reductions in costs and quick benefits. I think this will be important for people to understand the broader benefits of integration. So if we make quick wins, quick progresses on specific issues, I think that will help the broader agenda. Now, the longer-term challenge, again, has to be seen in light of these incentives that different countries face. Again, the issue of loss of tax revenue from trade taxes. Again, the issue of asymmetries in terms of costs and benefits from regional integration. Do we need some mechanisms to compensate countries that are at different levels of development or institutional strength? These are the issues that need to be addressed over the long term.
Okay. Also, with respect to the current economic climate, the current global economic climate, if you can just highlight why it's so important for Africa to get on board this policy ASAP, given the growth levels that we're seeing in Africa, given its dependence on foreign trade with the developed economies?
Well, again, as we discussed earlier, it's important for Africa to become less vulnerable to external shocks. It's important for it to become less vulnerable to demand that's coming from Europe and increasingly from Asia now, or the US for that matter. So if Africa is able to strengthen its own regional integration, it will be less dependent and less vulnerable to shocks emanating from outside the continent.
Also, there's a big focus on agriculture as well. It will contribute to food security.
Yes, agriculture is one of the aspects where Africa needs to make strong progress, and it has to be focusing on increasing agriculture productivity, not necessarily production, but productivity. Because by increasing agriculture productivity, that is helping not only to increase the amount of food that's available, but also is generating more income for farmers in Africa. Many people in Africa face what can be called, some people have called, a crisis of translating work into income. People are working, but they are working in activities that pay very little or no wages at all, something that the ILO calls vulnerable employment. Almost 80% of people working in Africa are in vulnerable employment, meaning working in subsistence activities in agriculture or in low value added services. So by increasing agriculture productivity, there's a better chance of translating this work into actually income. At the same time, as more food becomes available, food prices come down, this generates more disposable income. Poor people spend a large share of their income on food, which then generates demand for other activities not linked to the food production. So it's this kind of unleashing this kind of dynamic that's so important. And again, regional integration can play an important role, because if a country is very small or landlocked, it's more constrained in the amount of trade that it can do with within itself. The market within itself constrains production. There is not as much possibility to have economies of scale that can unleash, for example, industrialization.
As a large market, you have more bargaining power.
Exactly. In fact, if you look at countries in Africa that export more to other African countries, they are South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and the Ivory Coast. Because these are the largest economies also in Africa and the more diversified economies. So many other economies are stuck in a set of limited activities, trapped, if you will. And if they are able to integrate better with other countries, that will also unleash their diversification and unleash their economic growth.
And it's unfortunate that the smaller countries are not buying into the whole concept of removing non-barrier tariffs, because they are the ones that really need to open up for more growth opportunities within the continent.
Exactly. I think in part that might be related to concerns about loss of fiscal revenue, even though most studies suggest that the losses would not be that high. But still, they are concerned with the short-term impact. And so that's a concern that needs to be addressed and looked into. how to compensate for this short-term cost that may exist.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
You're freezing, eh?
Yeah, it's cold.